soldiers, veterans with ties to NCMC and TJC, and or the local community, both living and deceased. All have served our country with great honor and sacrifice. Each year on this day, we dedicate time to our gratefulness for the freedoms we have due to their sacrifices. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, World War I, also known as the Great War, ended. At 5 a.m. that morning, Germany, bereft of manpower and supplies, faced with imminent invasion, signed an armistice agreement with the Allies in a railroad car outside Champagne, France. The First World War left 9 million soldiers dead, 21 million wounded, with Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, France, and Great Britain each losing nearly 1 million or more lives. In addition, at least 5 million civilians died in 1 year after the soldiers laid down. The signing of the armistice and President will of my remarks today. Armed forces meant to him, enemies laid down their arms in accordance with the armistice, which rendered them impotent to renew hostilities and gave the world an assured opportunity to reconstruct its shattered order and to work out peace for a new and just set of international relations. The soldiers and people of the European allies had fought and endured for more than 4 years to uphold the barrier of civilization against the aggressions of the armed force. We ourselves had been in the conflict something more than 1.5 years. With splendid forgetfulness and mere personal concerns, we remodeled our industries, concentrated our financial resources, increased our agricultural output, and assembled a great army, so that at the last of our power was a decisive factor in the victory. We were able to bring the vast resources, material and moral, of a great and free people to the assistance of the associates in Europe who had suffered in this war. Out of this victory, there arose new possibilities of political freedom and economic concert. The war showed us the strength of great nations acting together for high purposes, and the victory of arms foretells the enduring conquest which can be made in peace when nations act justly and in furtherance of their common interests. To we in America, the reflections of Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in our country's service, and with gratitude for the victory, both because of the thing from which it has freed us, but because of the opportunity it has given America to show our sympathy with peace and justice in the councils of nations. Veterans Day sadly does not receive the pomp and circumstance of other official U.S. holidays. However, every year on November 11th, we as Americans take time to recognize the heroes among us. They are the men and women who serve in our armed forces. They are the veterans of the United States military. For all they have done and sacrificed for the rest of us, we are forever grateful. With those words, I kindly ask that you show reverence and honor on this day. More importantly, think of those you know from families and friends who have served, and the possibility who even made the sacrifice of their lives for our freedoms and those of the nations around the world. Thank a veteran for his or her service. For what they have done as individuals and collectively, it is a very small gesture in comparison to their sacrifices. At this time, I recognize the Trenton Fire and Trenton Police Departments for their service to our community, as well as their presence today at our roll call ceremony. There are 24 students on the NCMC campus who receive veterans benefits, some of which are veterans, others which are dependents or spouses of veterans or active military personnel. Led by SFC Clint Bain and Kerrigan Moore and SBC Ronald Woods, the Army National Guard members of Trenton's own 548th Transport Company will present the colors for the event. Thank you. Now I call on Professor Amy Guthrie, and after the reading of the roll call and Dr. Alley's remarks, we will conclude the event with a campus-wide moment of silence. Professor Guthrie.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Amy. Now Taylor will come back to the microphone.
NCMC is proud to recognize and remember our veterans. Today we will read the names of 491 veterans, both living and deceased, as well as active duty members with ties to NCMC Trenton Junior College and or the local community. Joining me to read the roll will be student leaders Chase Maddox, Shelby Moore, Milo Costner, Wayne Mamalisis, Ethan Shoup, Andrea Jenkins, Jacob Jackson, Halida Amon, Luis Ramirez, Reagan Logas, Max Heinz. Please solemnly join us in remembering our veterans as their names are read.
Jerry Acuff, Tommy Adams, Eric Alexander, Maurice Alexander, Steve Allen, Paul Allen, Jerry Ray Allnut, Donald Dean Allnut, Corporal Angela Altus, Don Altus, Marty Allenbaugh, Kim Anderick, Staff Sergeant Tyler Anderson, Bill J. Osmus, Lieutenant William R. Austin, Wilbur Austin, Lloyd Bain, Eddie J. Baker, Earl Wayne Baker, PFC Burl G. Baker, Jim Barnes, Randall R. Barnes, Robert L. Barnes, Tech 5 Thomas M. Barnes, Mike Barnes, Gerald D. Barnett, Carol Dwayne Bayer, Bill Bayer, Leo Bell, PFC Paul W. Bennett, Ernest L. Berry, Kenneth Berry, Bill Beverlin, Richard Black, Lloyd Bowenkamp, John Bowman, Mac Bonta, Bobby Bosley, Fireman First Class Kenneth P. Bosley, Kenneth Bowie.
Zane Bratsburg, Army Reserve. Corporal Harry W. Bratton, Army. Gordon Brick, Leonard Brick, Charles Brown, Sergeant Chester J. Brown, Army. Corporal Thomas V. Brown, Marine Corps. Private Charles F. Brown, Army. Ensign Herbert D. Brown, Navy. Yeoman 3rd Class Richard Brown, Navy. Darrell Browning. David Berkebile. Corporal Eugene P. Burkholder, Army. Howard Burris. James Bush. Frederick Caldwell. Paul Caldwell. Kenneth Collin. Byron Campbell. Raymond Carnes. Andrew J. Carnes, Army. Irving Charles Roy Carpenter. Ronald Chandler. Christine Cheney, Army. Robert J. Chenoweth. Kent Clodfelter, Army. Private Lumiel E. Jean Clutter, Army. Alan Randall Cobb. Clifford Connors. Ray E. Kuski, Navy. Donald E. Kuski, Navy. Robert Kuski, Army. Jerry Kuhn. Lowell Kuhn. Roger Cooper. Harry W. Corbin. Edward Corbin. Lieutenant Jacob H. Cords, Jr., Army Air Corps. Tech 5 John F. Cox, Army. John F. Cox, Sergeant, East 6, U.S. Army.
Private Robert M. Cox, Accident, Army. Norman Crawford. Lieutenant Beth Crawford, Air Force Reserve. Lee Creason. John Crooks. Brad Cross, Air Force. Albert Cross, Army. Major General Enoch H. Crowder, Army. Charles E. Croy. Harold Cyphers, Jr. Billy A. Davidson. Charles H. Davidson, Army. Jerry Davis. Kenneth Davis. W. Kurt Deegan. Master Sergeant Edward D. Dennis, Marine Corps. William Denny Denslow, Jr. Cecil Desper. O. B. Duvall. Second Lieutenant R. M. Dickerson, Army Air Corps. Herman Dickman. Private First Class Gary M. Dolan, Army. Yule D. Donovan. Ronald Dowell. David Dowell. Sergeant Hugh A. Drennan, Army. Kenneth W. Dudley. Tech 5 George F. Duncan. Sergeant William A. Duncan, Army. Robert Duncan, Army. Sergeant William J. Billy Jack Dye, Army. Jeff Eads, Marine Corps. Tom Eads, Marine Corps. Keith Edmondson, Navy. PFC Isaac H. Elliott, Army. Specialist Lebby Endicott, Missouri National Guard. Willie H. Estes. Chester Ewing. L. D. Gibson. Charles Giles.
John Hudson. Laurie Hofstadter. Lieutenant Wilford Fair, Army. Corporal Frank J. Fair, Army. Caitlin J. Figgins, Army National Guard. Caleb Figgins, Army. Vince Fender. Earl Dean Ferguson. Ralph Ferguson. Elise Ferris. Private First Class Donald P. Findley, Army. Corporal Louise F. Findley, P. Army. Billy Max Fitzpatrick. Sergeant James A. Fitzpatrick, Marine Corps. Lee O. Flesher. Jim Forbes, Marine Corps. Sergeant Nathan E. Foster, Army. William Foster, Army. Corporal Charles M. Frame, Navy. Lieutenant Donald French, Navy. Greg Frost, Navy, Army Air Force. Private First Class Roscoe W. Fry, Army. Junior H. Fry, Army. Private First Class Russell L. Folks, Army. Michael Joseph Forlum. Robert E. Bab Gallup, Army Air Corps. Kenneth Gannon. Private First Class Orville H.C. Gannon, Marine Corps. Richard L. Gardner. Frank Garner. Eugene Garrison. Private First Class Harley D. Garrison, Jr., Army. Gail Gartside. Glenn Gates. Sergeant David F. Gentry. Jim George. Lester George. Private Raymond S. Gibler, Army. Staff Sergeant Gordon L. Gibler. M.S. Gibson. Steve J. Gibson.
Les Giles. Roy Gilmore. Tech 5 Eugene Goldsby, Navy. H.E. Grant. Larry Griffin. Richard Griffin. Wayne Griffin. Jack Griffin. Sergeant Garth Griswold, Army. Sergeant Renee Griswold, Army. Richard Gill. Jack Guthrie, Navy. Sergeant Floyd Gwynn. Private William H. Hall, Army. Michael G. Hamilton. Brad Hammer. Wayne Leroy Haynes. Gary Ray Harmison. Vince Harris, Navy. Lieutenant Colonel Harry G. Hartley, Marine Corps. Dale Hayes. William E. Heck. Danny Hine. Donnie Helmendaler. Butch Henderson. Ronald E. Herring. Skip Hessler. Russell Hickman. Dickie Hickman. Wendell Hickman. Carlos Hicks. Carol Hicks. Len H. Hill. H.F. Hoffman, Navy. Stuart F. Hoffman. George Holloway. Charles J. Hoover. David Hopp. PFC Jonathan M. Hostetter, Army. Gary Hudson. First Lieutenant Thomas O. Hudson, Army.
Private First Class Jacob W. Hodges, Army. Timothy R. Hodges, Navy. Max Holst. Ronald R. Humphreys. Jim Hurst. Raymond Hudson. Ronald Hudson. Sergeant Bea F. Heaton. Sergeant Kenneth J. Ishmael. Army Air Corps. Private John R. Israel. Gary R. Jackson. Jeffrey Jackson, Army. Brighton Jacques. Leonard D. Johnson. Harold W. Johnson. First Lieutenant Benjamin O. Johnson, Army Air Corps. Sergeant Kenneth Eugene Johnson, Army. Sergeant Melvin Johnson, Army. Richard Johnson. Staff Sergeant Roy H. Johnson Jolly, Army. Laverne Johnson. Russell Joyner. Private Donald Eugene Jones, Army. Private First Class Sterling O. Jones. W. J. Jones, Navy. Harry L. Jones, Coast Guard. Francis L. Kennedy. Private First Class Don Kennedy, Army. Alfred Kern. J. A. Kelm. James Kidd. Michael P. Kidd. Kenneth Kidd. Silas Jean Kirk. Mike Kelp. Randy Kerbill. Doug Lair. Samuel H. Laird. Leonard Lame. Charles Lankford, Jr. Private First Class William C. Larmer, Marine Corps.
Benjamin O. Larimer. Chester V. Larimer. Lanny Mark Layson. Candy Lee, Marine Corps. Gary Lee, Navy. Robert E. Lee. Private First Class Charles Leeper, Army. Sergeant Truman Leeper. Seaman Second Class Carl T. Leeper, Navy. Seaman First Class John B. Leeper, Navy. Sergeant Teddy Leffler, Army. Bruce Linhart. Private First Class Robert Bobby Lewis. Carl Lindsay. Sergeant Leonard B. Lindsay, Army Air Corps. Corporal Carl Lindsay. Robert Lohman. Francis R. Long. Michael Louderback. Carrie Lowry, Air Force. Hubert Michael Lowry, Force. Private First Class Forrest M. Lowry, Army. Lewis Lynch. Scott Lynch, Army. Jim Mallow. Carl Dwight Maloney. Robert M. Manuel. John Maples. Alfred Marriott. Lieutenant Oscar Masters, Army Air Corps. Joe Maxey. Staff Sergeant Robert J. Maxfield, Army. Joe Maxey. Staff Sergeant Robert J. Maxfield, Army. Sergeant Robert E. Maxon, Army. Private First Class Richard E. Maxwell, Marine Corps. Darrell V. May. Robert McAllister. Dick McAtee. Staff Sergeant Howard McCarty, Army. Private Ray H. McClanahan, Army. And Floyd McClure.
Dennis McClure. Mike McClure. First Lieutenant Rupert E. McCallum, Army Air Corps. First Lieutenant Sean S. McCallum, Army Air Corps. Major William J. McCallum, Army Air Corps. Vernon McCullough. Cale McCullough. Corporal Vernon Lee McCure, Army Air Corps. Elton McKay. Paley McLean. Sergeant Floyd F. McLaughlin, Army. Corporal Carr M. McLaughlin, Army. Paul McNutt, William T. McReynolds, Navy. Chief Yeoman Earl McReynolds, Navy. Owen W. McVeigh, II. Eugene Mick, James A. Mick, Glenn Mick, Captain Chase Mick, Army. Richard Macon, Pan Merlin. Staff Sergeant Rex D. Merrill, Army Air Corps. Lawrence Del Mercevy. Staff Sergeant George A. Metcalf, Army. Charles Miller, Guy Mitchell, Wesley Mitchell, Henny Miller, Private First Class Carl W. Moore, Army. Eugene Moore, Steve Moisier, Francis Mosier, Max Matterfuck, Tim Montan, Kerry Timan, Private First Class Homer C. Mills, Army. Darwin Neighbor, Thewe Nia, Tech Sergeant Arthur Neff, and Corporal Raymond L. Neff.
Specialist Edward E. Neal, Army. Aviation, Metalsmith, 3rd Class David L. Newker, Navy. Seaman, 1st Class William D. Newton, Navy. Seaman, 1st Class Jack N. Newton, Navy. John T. Noe, Corporal Joseph Lewis Norton, Army. Sergeant Richard E. O'Brien, Army. Kenneth T. Olson, Sean Overton, Army. Private First Class Ray H. Overton, Marine Corps. Private First Class Tom Overton, Army. Edgar Parker, Tommy Lee Pryor, Corps Passac. Neil T. Perry, David Arthur Purcell, John Arthur Purcell, Holly Ivor Purcell, Army. Ron Purcell, Robert Pester, Larry D. Peters, Gotti Peterson, CPO, Leonard N. Pugh, Army Air Corps. Don Michael Peaton, Jeffrey Peaton, PJ Puff, Private Albin Dale Pickett, Matt Preston, Army. Private Albert N. Prosser, Army. Donald Wayne Radcliffe, Paul Vincent Radcliffe. Captain Robert G. Reagan, Marine Corps. Robert Raceback, Anthony Tony W. Ralston, Air Force. Dennis Radcliffe, Rupert Radcliffe. John Allen Ray, Christopher Records, Army. Robert Reeves, Charles David Reeds, Lieutenant Commander Walter E. Rena, Navy.
PFC Donald E. Riggs, Army. Michael Ritko. John Irving Roberts. Larry Robertson. Lige Robertson, Navy. Staff Sergeant William M. Robertson, Army Marine Corps. Sergeant Zane Robertson, Army. James Romsberg. Nathan Rohrbeck. Private Denver G. Ross, Army. Kenneth Ross, Navy. Lieutenant Henry Russell, Army. Jeff Saul, Navy. Sergeant Ronald W. Schweier, Army. Gene Schweier. Lennon Schweier. Sergeant Philip J. Schwalberg, Army. Chris Schmidt, National Guard. Donnie Scott. Robert Scott. Joe E. Seymour. Basil Seymour. Jerry Sharp. Woodson Sharp. James Joseph Shaw. Michael Leroy Shaw. Staff Sergeant Marin J. Shores, Army. Danny Schuler.
Harry Sink, Neil Smith, John Sam Smith, Marine Corps, Randy Smith, Charles Smith, Private Ernest Smith, Army, Master Sergeant Larry Smith, Air National Guard, Gary Sparks, Larry Spencer, Eldon Spencer, Colonel Donald R. Spoon, Air Force, PFC Garland F. Illness, Army, Earl V. Stevens.
Fireman 2nd Class James G. Stevens, Navy. Major William Dale Stepp, Army. Corporal Harold W. Sterling, Army. Jerry L. Stevenson. Henry Stickler. William G. Stinson. Kenneth Stottlemyre. Robert Bob Sottler. Brad Strine, Army. Private 1st Class Virgil G. Stewart, Army. Lieutenant Robert Tate. George Taylor. Claudius Taylor, Army Air Corps. Seaman 2nd Class Cecil P. Terhune, Navy. Seaman 2nd Class John C. Terhune, Navy. Billy Tharp. Private Harold Elliott Thomas, Canadian Armed Forces. Jim Thomas, Army Reserve. Private 1st Class Charles D. Thomas, Army. Tommy Thomason. Corporal William L. Thompson, Army. Private 1st Class Jack P. Thompson, Army. Private G.E. Thompson, Army. Lieutenant Charles A. Thompson. Airman 1st Class John Tyner, Air Force. Derek Todd, Navy. Dustin Todd, Navy. Michael L. Toll. Corwin Tracy. Lieutenant James F. Tracy, Navy. Dave Tracy, Army. Private 1st Class Richard L. Tracy, Army Air Corps. William A. Task. Captain Brent Trickle, Navy. Richard Trost. Lieutenant Dale. Colonel George Marine.
Richard Walker, Jim Walker, Jeb Walker, Marine Corps. Curtis Ward, Lieutenant Frederick A. Watson, Army Air Corps. Captain Marmor R. Watts, Army. David Weatherfield, Navy. PFC Leonard W. Weaver, Army. Captain Marvel L. Webster, Army. Earl M. Weed, Army. Charles R. Welch. William B. Welch. Arnold Wharton, Edward Wharton, Navy. PFC Robert K. Wan, Army. Harrison Wheeler. Brigadier General Terry G. Whitner, USA Air Force. William R. Witt, Gary Wharton. Lieutenant Eugene Wiggins, Navy. PFC Russell G. Wilbur, Army. Lieutenant Philip G. Wild, Jr., Navy. Jerry E. Chick Williams. Robert Lee Williams. Ryan Williams, Army. PFC James O. Williams, Army. Staff Sergeant Ronald R. Wilson, Army. Captain Richard Wilson, Navy, Army. Howard R. Wilson, Navy. Private James P. Wiseman, Army. James A. Witten. Gary Woldridge. Lieutenant Donald C. Woodward, Army Air Corps. Captain Harold B. Wright. Tracy Wayne, Air Force. Tech Sergeant Jennifer Wine, Air Force. Seaman 2nd Class Ernest L. Yardley, Navy. Staff Sergeant James T. Yeater, Army Corps. And now I would like to ask NCMC Vice President Dr. Alley to give our closing remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. As we conclude today's ceremony, we extend our deepest gratitude to all veterans for your service, sacrifice, and unwavering strength. Your dedication has safeguarded the freedoms and security we cherish today, and for that we owe you a debt beyond measure. In accordance with federal law, the United States observes a national moment of silence each Veterans Day to honor the service and sacrifice of all who have worn the uniform of our nation. We invite you to join that moment of reflection at 1 p.m. this afternoon. As we depart, let us carry forward the spirit of this day with respect, gratitude, and a renewed commitment to serve our communities and our nation, following the examples set by our veterans. A special thank you to the Trenton Fire and Trenton Police Department and all first responders for honoring our veterans and for your continued service to our community. Before leaving, please visit the NCMC alumni table to receive an American flag lapel pin, a small symbol of remembrance and a reminder to never forget the sacrifices made by the men and women of our armed forces. Thank you once again to our veterans, and thank you to all who joined us today in honoring their service and sacrifice. I now ask our Army National Guard members to conclude our ceremony by retiring our colors. Thank you.
And with the retiring of the colors and the minute of silence, that ends our ceremony. Thank you for coming.